That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G is specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. Hello and welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly news podcast of the Free Speech Union. Welcome back to all of our listeners and welcome back to all of our viewers. And the big topic for today is academic freedom. Very familiar topic. We cover it in some way. We probably cover it every week at the Free Speech Union. I look back at the latest numbers we had from our quarterly dashboard of our cases at the Free Speech Union, and around about 16%, that's 1/6, relate directly to our higher education institutions, our universities and our colleges. And that has maybe ticked down a little over the last few months as we've had a lot more come in relation to the state and police forces and things like that. But it's still a very significant amount of what we do. And we often also mention that it's as it were, our top institutions that are where we're getting most of our cases. So it's the Oxfords, it's the Cambridges, it's the Durhams, and that really jumped out of our stats pretty early on as well. But we are really excited today to welcome Dr. James Kierstead from New Zealand, who has written a report hot off the press. Actually, I think it was in August, on the state of free speech and academic freedom specifically in New Zealand. And so today we are going to really zoom in on that report and on the findings of the report. But welcome, James. It's good to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I should just give a bit of feedback on who you are and your background. So you are doctor. You're a doctor or a professor, James?
I'm a doctor. I used to be a senior lecturer, but I stopped being a senior lecturer last year, a few months after I came out with another report from the New Zealand Initiative, this time on the number of administrators at New Zealand universities. So I'm now just a humble doctor.
And so I'm reading your bio here from the top of your report, and it says you're now a senior fellow at the New Zealand Initiative. And the New Zealand Initiative is, I think it's the largest non-partisan think tank in New Zealand. And your work there focuses on universities, free speech and democracy. And you are a classicist. We were joking before we clicked on the record button that we could do this podcast in Latin or Greek, but then we figured that might be a little bit too much.
We don't want to show off.
And I can only do a few stock phrases.
I got 95% in a Latin test once, but that was when I was 13, so that's the limit of my...
That's pretty good. You should have
I know, but then I stopped. And they're all about farmers.
Yeah, right.
Well, the first time that the state of academic freedom crossed my radar, James, was back in 2021, where there was this letter that was written by Professor Garth Cooper and other academics, I think, at Auckland University. And they were writing in to say that they were worried that some of the Māori stories were going to get equivalents to science and pure science in, I can't remember exactly which courses it were.
Yeah, that was the school curriculum. So this was the listener letter, so-called, because it was a letter to the Listener magazine. And they were worried about the incorporation of what's called Mātauranga Māori, which translates to something like Māori traditional lore, into the school curriculum, and specifically into the school science curriculum. If you read that letter, and you can look it up, I think most reasonable people would think, it's a very sensible letter. It's not inflammatory. It's not hateful. It just states the author's view that science is different to Mātauranga Māori and that we should defend science. They also defend science against the claim that it's somehow intrinsically colonial.
Yeah.
And the reaction to that was overwhelmingly negative. But not only that, people seem to attack their right to say these things. And they were denounced in turn by all these big institutions, including the University of Auckland that all of the letter writers work for. Also the Tertiary Education Union, the New Zealand Association of Psychologists, a few other institutions. And so I just showed to people, I think, what happens if you step out of line and if you defend something which now apparently is not PC.
It was a very interesting one. It certainly hit the press over here. The article I was reading, we had Toby Young actually comment in that article about how this idea of not being able to put science first and say, well, actually, there is a distinction between a sort of tradition and science, and that this would actually harm or have a most detrimental effect on Maori children, ironically, who are already maybe starting further back in terms of opportunity, and yet they're not going to be able to leap forward because they're not going to get the pure science teaching and grounding that would then enable them to really be catapulted into the academic world. I thought it was a really interesting.
That's exactly right. And Garth Cooper, one of the signatories to that letter, actually has Maori ancestry, and he's become a very distinguished medical scientist. Yeah. And a lot of his work was going around poor Maori communities and doing studies and helping out and sort of spreading information about obesity. Yeah. And obviously, information he was spreading about obesity was universal science. It came from the whole world of science, from England, from America, from Japan. And maybe there were some insights from Maori traditions, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is to focus on what works. And so I think, people like Garth Cooper who have Maori ancestry. Most of them see this, that people want, just what works and what is actually true. And but unfortunately, the university and the sort of official classes, the media and the universities are dominated by this view that it's somehow kind of rude or hateful to say that there's a distinction between traditional lore and science.
So in your paper, James, that was the first time that cropped up and crossed my radar. Your paper is a broader and deeper dive into the state of academic freedom. How would you summarize your findings for our listeners and for our viewers?
Well, okay. Basically, we had testimonies and we had surveys, and then we had a list of incidents. So we had all of these incidents. The listener letter was actually one of them where people got mobbed or people were deplatformed. And we had surveys showing that a lot of academics, significant minorities, in some cases sort of small majorities of academics, feel they can't speak about certain topics, especially the Treaty of Waitangi, which we can get into later, and sort of gender ideology. And we also had testimonies, many of which suggested that academics feel fearful about talking about certain topics in class. So they are afraid that students are going to denounce them to the higher-ups, to the administrators, and they're afraid that the administrators aren't going to back them, and that they're going to get in trouble from the administrators as well.
Yeah.
Well, that all sounds very familiar.
Yep.
Although I suppose there does seem to be this very strong focus here on sort of really foundational ideas which become unquestionable. So in the case of New Zealand, you were saying that just any kind of discussion about the Treaty of Waitangi becomes impossible, which obviously is incredibly important. Will keep on recurring as something that will be revisited in history and in politics. But then also the gender-sex distinction and how we understand that becomes unquestionable. How do you understand that kind of this sort of attempt to create new unquestionable shibboleths? Really, I mean, what do you think is going on there?
Well, I mean, I think it's sort of similar to other places in the English-speaking world. They're very similar sort of shibboleths. The Treaty of Waitangi happens to be a treaty between Maori and the British Crown, but it's effectively about Indigenous affairs. So there's this idea that sort of we've oppressed Indigenous people, which we did, to be fair, in the past. We did sort of bad things to Indigenous people, but because of that, they've almost become sort of sacred, and you have to have this particular far-left, extremely progressive interpretation of Indigenous and colonial history. So I think the New Zealand case, the sensitivity of the Treaty of Waitangi is just one subset of that larger concern. Mm. And obviously in this broader progressive Anglophone culture, sex and gender has also become a lightning rod. And there the orthodox view now is, of course, as you know, that effectively there's no biological sex. It's all a spectrum. All sort of observable differences between the sexes or the genders are a matter of culture. And so that's what's happened in New Zealand too. And so we had a couple of incidents where gender-critical feminists. In one case, one gender-critical feminist speaker was deplatformed from Auckland University of Technology And then we had another incident where at Massey University, there was a conference called Feminism 2020, I think, that was actually booked into the university, into the space at the university. And they canceled that whole conference. They deplatformed that. So I think it's very much part of the larger Anglophone culture. And this is kind of what you'd expect from New Zealand, because we take part in a lot of different trends from the rest of the Anglophone world. And so with my report, what I was trying to do is just sort of see, do we have the same trends with cancel culture? It seems like, if you just follow the news, it seems like we did, but I wanted to try and be more systematic and collate all the evidence to show that this really is happening in New Zealand as well.
Mm-hmm. One thing,
and it's actually interesting because one of the criticisms that we get, people in the free speech movement in New Zealand, is that we're somehow importing this sort of radical American view that free speech is important. Whereas I actually think that what we've imported is sort of a radical leftist view from elite universities in the United States and in Britain increasingly.
Yes.
And actually the free speech view, the view that people should be free to say what they want, is actually a tradition in the whole of the Anglosphere, not only in the United States, where obviously they're lucky to have the First Amendment. So there it was kind of, established pretty strongly. But it's actually a tradition in Canada. It's a tradition in England, obviously. Tradition started in England. And it's a tradition in Australia and New Zealand as well.
Yes, exactly that argument was made at an event on academic freedom that I went to recently, actually, where the people who were one of the people that was arguing against there being a crisis of free speech in British universities said that this is an imported right-wing American argument. And it's kind of a fabricated problem. And of course, the point has been made brilliantly the other way around, similar to what you're saying, which is that, the kind of woke thinking, or whatever you call it, you call it progressive radicalism in your report, is in effect the kind of new version of American colonialism. And these kind of monocultural ideas.
We can talk about American free speech fundamentalism, like if we get to a case which is really extreme. I don't know what the example would be, but something where the Americans have been ahead of the pack in sort of free speech. But normally what we're talking about with these deplatformings and cancellations and these letters, or these controversies over letters, are things that actually, like, no one doubted 5 years ago that we should be able to talk about. Of course, we should be able to talk about sex and gender. That's not really a philosophically interesting case for free speech. Of course, we should be able to talk about colonial history. So these are just things that the principle remain the same, or it should have remained the same, but it's just that the underlying culture has changed so massively over the past 5 years that now a certain number of people look around and say, oh, this is really extreme that some people are defending free speech. It's like, no, you're the ones that have actually become more extreme.
And is there a knitting together of the two issues, the indigenous culture issue and the sex and gender? Because when I quickly was Googling yesterday about, I just kind of Googled Maori and I can't remember something else. And then what immediately comes up is this idea that Maori culture is much more queer, much more accepting of equality, that it never had inequality between the sexes, that it was much more LGBTQ plus. I mean, that.
It's complicated because if you visit the Pacific Islands, as I have, I've been to Samoa and Tonga and Fiji, there are more trans people. And actually there were even when I went there for the first time in the 90s. So there is an indigenous tradition of that sort of thing. I don't know how far back it goes. But no, I'm kind of skeptical like you, because it seems like the official academic view is that Maori before colonization were basically sort of 21st century Victoria University of Wellington students. They sort of project their own progressive views onto the past, I think, and that always is slightly suspicious. For a start, I'm not sort of denigrating their past. Traditionally, Maori were very violent. They fought lots of wars against each other. When the Europeans came, there were the musket wars where they took advantage of European technology to settle old scores. And frankly, I don't even blame them. I think that, most people on Earth before modernity were very violent, and they would have done the same. And we can see similar things happening as sort of technology spreads across other parts of the world. But I just think it's strange that, this sort of utopian vision is now one that is very difficult to question. The Paul Moon, who's a historian, a noted historian, again at Auckland University of Technology, he published a book a few years ago about the practice of cannibalism in the South Seas and in New Zealand in particular. And there's a huge blowback against that. But again, the point isn't to denigrate anyone in the present. It's just to say these things happened in the past and they were common. If we want to understand ourselves as human beings, we have to understand that these things happened and, how they happened. And we can go into the details if we'd like. And that's healthy. That's what academia should be doing.
And just for our listeners and our viewers, one thing that's mentioned in the report, and we've already touched on it, in this discussion a little bit is this Treaty of Waitangi. Now, this treaty goes back to the 19th century, doesn't it? But as you said, it was between the British and the Maoris. Now, I thought it was something more recent, a more recent debate maybe between the Maori and the rest of the New Zealand population, but it actually goes back a long time. And as I understand it, it's your equivalent of sort of our anti-racism training, or there's this idea that you should always consider Maori issues on everything.
Yeah. So, but you might think it's later, because what happened was basically the Treaty of Waitangi signed in 1840, so a long time ago.
Yeah.
For a long time, it's kind of in abeyance. There's a notorious phrase by a judge at some point who calls it a simple nullity. But then in the sort of 1950s and 60s and 70s, there's the Maori Renaissance. And people start looking back at the Treaty of Waitangi as a sort of source for civil rights, basically. Because the Treaty of Waitangi seems to say, definitely says, that Maori should have the same rights and duties as British subjects. And so then people started arguing, okay, well, our rights are being, abrogated in various ways, so we need to refer to the Treaty of Waitangi. Then the sort of final phase of this happened, I think, in the 1980s, end of the 80s, early 90s, when various judges and jurists read what they called treaty principles into the treaty. And so you'll hear a lot of talk nowadays at New Zealand universities about the treaty as a partnership. I don't actually think the word partnership is anywhere in the Treaty of Waitangi, but there's this idea that, there's a partnership between Maori and the Crown, and also that the treaty not only kind of justifies, but also sort of mandates various other practices. Like, I've heard people at the university I used to work for basically imply that the treaty mandated affirmative action, right? Every time I hear something about what the treaty says, I look back at the actual text of the treaty, and I would actually encourage listeners to just Google full text of the Treaty of Waitangi, because it's actually not very long. The preamble is actually almost longer than the text. It's only 3 articles. So it's very short. And I always look back, because I always think, there must be like affirmative action in the Treaty of Waitangi, but it's not there. So that's the debate. So these legal boffins basically read into the text all of these things that are arguable. Let's put it that way.
Except now they're not, James, because that's the point, isn't it? That the chilling effect on free expression is that they're no longer arguable, or it's very difficult to put various
That's
sides.
right. Well, they're not arguable in a university. One thing that has happened recently, though, is that David Seymour, the leader of the ACT Party, so this is a kind of a libertarian party in New Zealand, he has brought forward a bill which is supposed to sort of set in stone what he thinks the real principles are. And he wanted to put that to a referendum. So his idea was, okay, we'll put it to the people. The people can actually decide what the treaty really says, what we think the treaty really says. And that will then sort of either confirm or overturn what the legal mind said at the end of the 80s. But the reaction to that, I think the ability to sort of discuss this in broader society is much wider, much broader than in universities. But the reaction to that was still pretty strong, let's say, and I personally don't think that it has been a model of deliberative democracy.
It's really interesting, this trend, isn't it? How everywhere there's, we had a lecture given for us by Professor Frank Furedi a month or so ago, and he talks about the war against the past, and that being a kind of the common theme across all of these developments in the Anglo-American world. Which is that kind of search, if you like, for an original sin. And it's a way in which we kind of reconfigure relationships in the present by turning our attention to the past. And it's kind of curious, because what seems to happen is that there's attention paid to sort of 17th and 18th century phenomenon, maybe 19th century, 18th and 19th century phenomenon. And then anything that might have happened in the 20th century is kind of flattened out and effaced. So the fact that there was civil rights, for example, in America is now seen as if that gained nothing, and that anything that was learnt from that and a kind of new consensus that might have been forged through that struggle is then just becomes completely lost, and we're sort of thrust back into a I don't know what you'd call it, a pre-progressive period in the sense of the real meaning of progressive, I suppose.
I also argue that they forget the past before the 18th century, before the European colonial period as well, because I think a lot of kids seem to come out of university nowadays thinking that British colonialism was kind of new. They're the first people to sort of go to other countries and take over their land, whereas actually if you look at the record of history, this is pervasive. It's basically like what any advanced society does once they reach a certain size. You can go back to Sargon of Akkad, you can go back to ancient Assyria. And they're doing the same thing. Arguably, they're doing it much more brutally, actually, with fewer kind of conditions and rules. And they're taking over other people's land, and they're imposing their religion on them. They're saying you have to worship Asher, if not, we will basically impale you. And so that's the way of the world. And for me, the really astounding thing about British and American history is actually that, yes, they had slavery, they participated in it, but those two societies were actually some of the only ones on record that actually fought against slavery at great cost to themselves. I mean, the American case in the American Civil War, and in the British case, in terms of their sort of stamping out slavery, making it illegal within the British Empire. And they had to actually recompense slaveholders. So that came at an immense cost. And a lot of other societies at the time were looking at them. I mean, Islamic societies, for example, which had slaves, and they just thought they were crazy. And so I think it's not great that students can come out of university nowadays, and the only thing they know, it seems, or one of the main things that they know, is about the Atlantic slave trade. Yes, that happened, but, as I say, the really interesting thing, the thing that made British and American history unusual, is actually lost. So it's kind of a war over the past, I suppose. And academics, left-wing academics have always warned us that people in the present can use the past for ideological reasons. And that's absolutely true. If you go back far enough, the British Empire used the past for ideological reasons. You can use the past in a jingoistic fashion, but you can also use the past in a sort of self-hating fashion. And I think, both of those attitudes are equally something that can distort what really happened. And now, of course, the universities are not jingoistic at all, but they are distorting the past, arguably, in this other direction.
I wonder how much of it goes back to Marxism, Jan and James. I mean, in terms of that was the big philosophy of so much of the 20th century, Marxism, and the various forms of it outworking in Soviet world, and then now China as well. And the idea that that's driving a lot of political thought still, and therefore it isn't critiqued in the same way, despite the fact it led to tens of millions, arguably hundreds of millions of deaths through the 20th century. Somehow those...
I actually had a conversation, I remember, at Victoria University of Wellington when I first got there, and I met someone, and she said, I'm working on Mao. And I went, oh, right, one of the greatest murderers in human history, or, responsible for the most deaths. Because actually with Mao, you could say, they just died through... a lot of them died in the Great Famine.
So they didn't have anything to eat, and then there was the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah. There was that too. So he basically was responsible for these deaths. But anyway, I remember her response was just to say, "Oh, I think that's been misinterpreted."
Well, I think there's
that's typical. You find these very extreme, like that. I would defend to the death, those people's rights to sort of argue those things. But it's very typical of modern universities that you find these very extreme views, but only from one side, right? You would never find anyone at a modern university who defended sort of a right-wing dictator as misunderstood. And maybe that's a good thing, but it just shows how strong the slant is.
Well, there's definitely an absolute failure on the left to have a proper reckoning with its own legacy. And I have come from the left. I spent a lot of time reading Marx, amongst many other things. But I noticed, I knew at the time that there, amongst the rest of the left, was this incredible ability to not apologise for anything, and to actually excuse absolutely anything that happened in the 20th century in the name of radical politics.
I'll say as well, yeah,
and it's never been a reckoning.
There's never been a reckoning. I mean, I thought that we had that reckoning with Tony Blair. I thought we had that reckoning with the Third Way when they put that behind them, but. Yeah, apparently not. I mean, what I was going to say is that I'm not against students reading Marx, of course. I mean, I've read Capital. I mean, abridged version.
They should. But we should.
Of course, right? We want to have some academics who have left-wing views, and we want to have some academics who have right-wing views. But this is really the nub of the problem: is that there's this huge political slant. And I've actually looked at figures. There's good figures for the U.S., for Canada, for the U.K., for Australia. We don't have that good data for New Zealand at the moment, but it seems like we have the same effect in New Zealand, and that is that it's just hugely skewed to the left, and it's not just sort of their slightly more left-wing academics. In some American university departments, there's a ratio of something like 30-1 in some humanities departments. So that is 30 Democrats for every one Republican. And James, in some university fields, actually, in some academic fields in the States, the study I'm thinking of, they couldn't find anyone who was right of center in, I think, anthropology and sociology.
But doesn't that see? I always find that. I mean, I think that's true, but that problem of recruitment or of right-wing people going into academia must predate. They haven't all been driven out, so there must have been a prior problem of conservative and right-wing people not going into academia, presumably. Because when I was a student in the late 80s, early 90s, there was definitely a real mixture of people, and also you didn't necessarily know what people thought, and they certainly were not. Most academics were not activist academics; they were, scholars. Whereas by the time I left academia, when I was applying for jobs, they were asking me whether I had a commitment to social justice in the application. So there's been a transformation in the institution. But I think prior to that, the skewing to the left, I think may well, some of the blame for that may well lie among, in the laps or hands or whatever you say, of conservatives and right-wingers who didn't necessarily head in. Well, they didn't head into the academy. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, people on the right went into the city, didn't they?
No, that's right. I mean,
guilty.
So when you were in the
mathematician like Tom, he goes into the city.
Well, no, it's true. I mean, that's one argument that right-wing people have even sort of different personality profiles, and so left-wing people are more into they would put it like this, that they're more public-spirited, so they're more willing to work for the state, if you want to put it that way. Whereas right-wingers are more entrepreneurial. Some people say it's just a matter of personality and it's self-selection. Although I've also read articles, there was a good article in Heterodox Academy a few years back by somebody saying, well, what does self-selection actually look like? And in some cases, you say, these right-wingers kind of gave up the ghost and they left academia. In a lot of cases, I kind of understand why. And the why is often something that isn't very flattering to academia as it is at the moment. I mean, it often looks like, if these were social justice types who had those experiences, they would be complaining about bullying. And so some of them do. I mean, so basically what I'm saying is the atmosphere in academia is so strange and so slanted. And you're so liable to be ostracized by peers if you say anything centrist, that I do think it doesn't absolve academia of having a problem just because some people choose to leave. And a lot of people also get forced out. But what you were saying actually is interesting, because there's a study that Noah Carl did for the Adam Smith Institute a few years ago. And there's a very similar graph that you can see that Heterodox Academy put up a few years ago. And in both cases in the States and the UK, you look at left-wing and right-wing academics over time, and you can see them diverge gradually. So in the 70s, I think in the 60s and 70s, there are still more left-wing academics, but only just. And it's quite balanced. And then as things go forward, there are more and more left-wingers and fewer right-wingers. And so I think that this shows that there's some kind of dynamic here, that things have gotten worse. And the more left-wingers there were, the more sort of empowered they felt, the more open they felt about, the more willing they felt to ostracize others and to bully others, I think, and to sort of impose shibboleths and taboos. And then these effects kind of ramp up. It's even less pleasant being, a part of sort of 5% of center-right academics than it was to be part of like 20% of center-right academics, right? And so these effects just get stronger and stronger. And we're at the point now, I think, where you get the reaction of the listener letter, where you just sort of say, here's like a vaguely centrist thing. I think science is different from indigenous lore. And not only does sort of half your peers get mad at you, like all these institutions, there's like unanimous condemnation of your view.
The pile on.
And so that's the situation we're in now.
James, one thing that comes up again and again in your report is the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. And interestingly, Jan and I were on a call recently where we talked through our data, our casework data. And one very good question from people on that call was, why does the CCP turn up in your list of institutions that are in your casework? And I explained it's often the Confucius Institutes where academics or students are raising concerns that actually something behind their free expression issues relates back to the Chinese Communist Party. But it seems to be of particular concern in your report. Do you have anything to say specifically on that area?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there was a cluster of incidents around, I think, 2020 and 2021. I think maybe just as we were going into COVID and then when the COVID measures were in place. And a lot of them had to do, maybe a bit earlier than that, but anyway, a lot of them had to do initially with protests in Hong Kong. And there were sort of protests by Hong Kong students and Chinese students who supported Hong Kong, and then there were sort of counter-protests. And you saw this across the English-speaking world. In Australia, there was actually a few incidents where there was sort of low-level violence, kind of fisticuffs kind of thing. In New Zealand, there's actually one episode, but you can actually find the video for it if you're really interested, where there's a female student, Serena Lee, I think she was called, who was protesting in favor of Hong Kong. and some Chinese men, it's not clear whether they were students or not, from mainland China, started sort of barracking her and shouting at her and saying, China is one, we should be united, Hong Kong is part of China. And she ends up on the ground. I mean, she gets a little shove at some point. So relatively minor in New Zealand, but that kind of thing did kick off around that time. But also, major problem for New Zealand universities is just how dependent we are now on China. And it's very similar to Australia. The vice chancellors in New Zealand have pursued this strategy of getting Chinese cash. Chinese cash not only on the student front in terms of foreign students, but also in terms of research. So New Zealand has the second highest number of foreign students in the world per capita after Australia. And a good chunk of those students are Chinese. So we really want the Chinese money. And what happens with this was shown in an incident in our report at Auckland University of Technology again, where there was a lecturer called Ji Ruan, who was from China originally. He came to New Zealand, and he booked a room in order to celebrate the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, presumably thinking, I'm in a free country now, I can do this. And the Chinese embassy actually wrote to the top brass at the Auckland University of Technology saying, expressing displeasure that they heard there was an event commemorating this event. And what do you think happened? Of course, they immediately caved. They seemed very pleased to be able to cooperate with the Chinese embassy on that. And the event was canceled, and they sent security to make sure that nobody turned up at the room.
But you have good legal protections, don't you, in New Zealand? There is the New Zealand Education Act. And again, something that came through your research is the theoretical framework is there for the protection of free expression. So in that context, it seems rather odd that the authority, I mean, it's not odd to those who've lived in the free speech world in Britain and the US, I guess, for a long time, but it seems odd that the authorities wouldn't have any thought to the legal framework and their legal responsibility to uphold academic freedom in New Zealand.
Yeah, I mean, the legal framework is there. The Education Training Act, which you mentioned, is very clear that students and academic staff have the right to try out new ideas and put forward unpopular opinions, which actually became the title of my report. But, the legal environment is only as strong as, our ability to actually implement it. And it seems like there's very little will to actually implement it. And one of the problems is that there are very few mechanisms to implement it. And this is why I'm saying, and other people are in the New Zealand Free Speech Union are saying, what we need is actually legislation at this point, which makes sure that legislation which actually has teeth, which actually makes sure that we can do something about this. So we look to the UK Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, because that actually would have, I mean, it looks like it's going to be repealed now, but it would have installed, a free speech czar in the Office for Students, the university regulator, and it would have introduced a new tort, so a new civil wrong, which would have allowed students and others to sue anyone who had breached their free speech rights after they'd exhausted an appeal or a complaint process. So we thought that would have been perfect in New Zealand, because as you say, the law is clear, but the fact that the law is clear hasn't mattered to vice chancellors and to top brass at the university who have just kind of rode roughshod over this for years. Yeah. I should mention another case, by the way, very egregious, because often it comes from the very top. It comes from the vice chancellor. So Massey University a few years ago, Don Brash, who was actually quite a prominent politician in New Zealand, he was head of the National Party, the main centre-right party, for a while. He was very close to being prime minister. He was head of the ACT Party, another right-wing party. He was governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. He has a PhD in economics. He's not just some kind of fringe figure. And he went to Massey University, and the vice chancellor canceled him. The vice chancellor deplatformed his talk, canceled the event. And she later said, this was because of credible threats of violence that we'd received. But luckily in New Zealand, we have an Official Information Act, which allows people to get hold of emails from officials in public institutions like universities. And you can read her emails. Again, this is easily Googleable, and it's really, really revealing when you see the emails, because immediately all the top brass, especially the vice chancellor, she starts to ask all of her colleagues, what can I do to shut this down, basically? She makes it very clear that she wants to shut it down because she does not like his political views and that she sees him as racist because of his view on, guess what? The Treaty of Waitangi. And that vice chancellor is still in her job, making several $100,000s a year. And even though I'm loath to sort of go after people's jobs because it sounds very much like sort of left-wing cancel culture, I do think that there has to be some kind of consequences for people who are actually running these universities and they're not obeying the law. I mean, they're blatantly just going against what the Education Act says.
Yeah, well, certainly when people running institutions no longer run institutions along the lines on which they should be run, that should be when there should be grounds then to get rid of these people. I mean, I don't think that's cancel culture. I think that's upholding the integrity of the institution.
Yeah, it's just good sense, right? Because, if you hire somebody to sort of drive a train and they're not driving the train, or they're not obeying, like, basic safety regulations, they can't drive the train anymore. And it's like, well, you're driving the university. One of the basic things you have to do is not
But
breach free speech.
isn't part of the problem that academic freedom has become only one amongst very many considerations that those running universities are taking on board, and actually it's slipped down the list over the years. And one of the things that you highlight in the report is this kind of focus on safety, and I wanted to ask you about that actually, because I think that's the sort of underpinnings which won't be touched by law, other than when somebody like a VC is claiming credible threats as a reason why you can't proceed with an event. But there's this other thing which I think is a kind of cultural problem amongst a younger generation, and has been cultivated by those who run institutions, which is you kind of invite students to find their particular vulnerability, and so then you just make it seem even more unsafe. So, for example, a conversation was relayed to me over the weekend, which is of a lecturer over here in the UK who more than 50% of her students are claimed to have some kind of special needs. Which, of course, what they mean by that is not like when I was teaching, it was dyslexia. Now it can be all manner of diagnoses or self-diagnoses, which basically is a claim to not be held as a student to the standards of the institution. And so everybody's trying to run away from the purpose of the university, which is to be able to write an essay, for example, and to think logically, and to be able to encounter all ideas. I remember when I had to undergo a teacher training course, and one of the lecturers who was teaching the teacher training said, well, maybe we should consider alternative methods of assessment. Why not think about collage?
Why not interpretive dance? Indeed. I mean, that's a whole different matter. Yeah. But I mean, I guess it's a consequence of this sort of increasing psychological fragility or lack of resilience. And look, I mean, if people have real issues, that's one thing. And I'm definitely in favor of sort of access for people who are actually disabled or having actual sort of mental health crises. But obviously, the definition of these things has broadened over time. And I also think, the way to treat these is by helping students and academics, if they need it too, to actually engage with the world and actually show themselves that they can do these things. There was an event at Victoria University of Wellington recently that the Vice Chancellor actually organized in order to show everybody that, free speech was going to be protected. He's the new Vice Chancellor. Free speech was now going to be protected at Victoria University of Wellington. He said, we're going to have a big event. We're going to discuss free speech. And he invited, I think, two people who were had a kind of classical liberal conception of free speech. Both of them who I happen to know. One of them was the head of the Free Speech Union. Another was Michael Johnson, my colleague at the New Zealand Initiative. And the Vice Chancellor was then, only a few weeks later, forced to suspend this event and put it off. And he actually reorganized it later with a different panel, with more people from different sort of identity groups. But one of the reasons that it was canceled in the first place was on the grounds that, or on the idea that, these people, Jonathan Ailing, the head of the Free Speech Union, and Michael Johnson, would sort of do harm to students, and students would be unsafe in their presence because they would be arguing in favor of free speech. And there was a student union leader who actually went on the radio, and she said, well, it was really problematic. One of the things that was terrible about it was that they were going to have it in this sort of public space at the center of the university. And what would have happened if even students who didn't come to the event, they might have been passing by and they might have heard some of these words, and then they could have been traumatized by that, right? So we have now like an incredibly broad conception of what's going to be psychologically harmful. And not only that, I mean, as I say before, it actually goes against a lot of the psychological evidence about what helps. Actually, it seems to be that there's a lot of evidence that what helps people become more robust is exposure, controlled exposure. You don't want to go crazy, but I mean, actually, students can deal with ideas. They can deal with descriptions of violence in text. They can deal with different views on the trans issues, and they're not going to freak out. And we need to sort of show that. Otherwise, it's going to make them worse.
There's such a double standard here as well, because when a pylon happens against or a disciplinary process is imposed on an academic or a student, there is no concern for their psychological welfare or safety. It's a complete...
Well, also, think about like Christians. I mean, I'm not a Christian, but I have Christian friends, and some of these people really believe, I'm not saying this contemptuously, some of these people really believe that, Christ is the Son of God, he's holy, you shouldn't, abuse him. You shouldn't take his name in vain. That's like a commandment from God. And we routinely ignore that at universities all the time, right? We constantly, people make jokes about Jesus all the time, make jokes about religion. And I'm actually fine with that because I think we should have a kind of an open atmosphere at universities. But it's very hypocritical to then say, well, I actually have my taboos as well. And you have to respect my taboos. I'm not going to respect your taboos, but you have to respect my taboos. It's either everybody gets a taboo or nobody, right? And I would prefer nobody. We have to be consistent. We have to be fair.
Well, that's interesting because that brings us on to a little story that happened in the UK Parliament this week, which was of a Labour MP who, what's his name, Tahir Ali, who said that he wanted there to be new legal protections against the desecration of all the Abrahamic religions, their texts and their ideas. And and it was really interesting because he framed it within the context of Islamophobia Awareness Week, but he managed to broaden it out to talk about all Abrahamic religions. But the response from the Prime Minister was just incredibly weak.
Very wet.
His response was, desecration is awful.
The response should have been, the response is so obvious. We do not have blasphemy laws. In fact, we got rid of our last blasphemy laws in this century. We're not about to smuggle them back in. But Jan, what I get depressed about is not just that question got asked in Parliament, and not just that our Prime Minister was so wet in Parliament in responding to that, but that actually we already have blasphemy laws in this country by virtue of the fact police are knocking on people's doors and things are being shut down on the basis of usually perceived Islamophobia. But
it's very interesting, the chronology of this, because just as the last laws against blasphemy were being repealed, you suddenly get this surge in hate speech laws, or kind of reinforced hate speech laws, which we almost had in New Zealand, but we were able to sort of fight off. But there was a big push for reinforced hate speech laws, which would actually have outlawed, abuse or mockery, I can't remember the exact language, of religions. And it's just very strange to me how this comes from the progressive left. I just find it very, very odd.
It's flipped in a very interesting way. Sorry, Jen.
Well, it's sort of, I suppose because they've waged war against all existing categories of belief, of idea, and even modes of inquiry, you can't actually really have a society based on nothing. So they kind of they have to recreate the sacred, and they recreate these kind of boundaries and borders, but in a different kind of way, which is actually not, it hasn't come from anything organically. It's a sort of borrowed set of ideas, which then has to be imposed, which is why it ends up so tyrannical. But there is a sort of re-sacralization going on, isn't there? But around these beliefs that nobody understands, which is why the language of gender and sex has to be enforced rather than people actually understanding what on earth they're supposed to be talking about when they say cis, for example, or whatever pronouns they're supposed to use. It's alien.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's what's made it particularly insidious, that it took us years, it took us centuries to understand that people feel very strongly about religion and that we should sort of live and let live, and that's the best way to do it. And so we've long thought of religion as sort of a special category. And we know that, you have to allow people to practice their religion in peace. And we also know that people shouldn't impose their religion on others in institutional settings. We have to be neutral. But with the new ideology, because it's not sort of labeled as a religion, at least not sort of by those who espouse it, it's almost like none of that applies. So it's like we're not imposing any kind of religion or ideology. We're just doing what's good and right and true. All good thinking people should think that, the far left interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi is right. If you don't, then you must be some kind of racist, right? So it's kind of religious thinking, but it hasn't been sort of labeled as religion. We don't recognize it as religion, and that means that people get a free pass just to impose it on others, or they think they have a free pass.
Well, I suppose it lacks the substance, but it has all the tools. The kind of enforcement tools are there, but without actually the sort of internal substance and coherence to it, which is why it's so mystifying when you have the progressive left somehow managing to get into bed with radical Islam.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. That's also an interesting thing with Polynesians and Maori culture in New Zealand as well, that I think very traditionally in Maori culture, on the marae, the ceremonial speaking house, women, I think, were meant to stand at the back, and they weren't really encouraged to speak. There's not very much of a record of women speaking in assemblies in traditional culture, and there have been a few moments, few flashpoints when I first got to New Zealand of traditional marae being held with contemporary academics, and people were kind of unsure where the women should go. Where to me, the answer seems obvious that we're modern people and the women are allowed to speak because we live in a liberal democratic society with equality between the sexes. But it's weird. This is kind of what happens. You identify the Maori as the colonized underclass. You make them sacred, but then that kind of messes with some of your progressive beliefs, because a lot of these traditional societies, unsurprisingly, in my mind, were not that progressive because they're traditional societies. And they were kind of like our society when we weren't that progressive in the past. They were quite top down. They were quite patriarchal.
Well, a friend of mine is a lecturer in New Zealand. I won't say where. I can't remember actually, but I know. But I wouldn't grass him up in that way. But he was saying that in the further education college that he teaches in, where they've kind of incorporated this whole way of thinking, when they hang photographic exhibitions by their students, there was one exhibition where they hung the work by female students below the work of male students. It's in order to comply with what they said were kind of Maori tenets. And I obviously have no idea if that's true or not, but he said it, and it was very, very difficult to challenge that, because you just know that you're going to be labelled as a racist in some way, which is extraordinary accommodation.
I also find it very interesting, going back to the point about religion, that the Pacifica are also sort of seen as a marginalized group, so people from Pacific Islands. And they're often they have this very progressive ideology foisted upon them. And with the gender thing, there may be some truth in it, but it's interesting to me that group is actually one of the most heavily Christian in New Zealand. So a lot of these people come from Samoa, and they're Methodists, or they come from Tonga, and they're Mormons. And then this campus culture is sort of telling them that they're all sort of genderqueer and whatever. And it's just a very weird fit. You have this sort of white elite that's telling them, oh, you guys are all very progressive, and sort of adopting them as kind of as sort of into their progressive army. And actually, a lot of these people are more conservative than they think.
James, obviously, we time is against us now, but in terms of the recommendations in your report, one of the ones that really jumped out at me was the annual audit of universities from a free expression perspective. And I thought that was a really interesting one, particularly as a data person. I think that kind of taking the temperature can be really effective, as long as it's done, obviously, consistently and frequently, i.e. every year. And the immediate thought I had on that was, that's a lot of work for an organization or for a group to do on a consistent basis. We used to have, in this country, there was, in the UK, there was a Spiked used to do a university rating or ranking, and they eventually stopped doing it. And I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I think one of the reasons for that was it was so intensive. It's hard work to do that and to maintain it and to publish it every single year. So, James, is that? I mean, what are your thoughts on that and how practical that is?
Yeah, the New Zealand Free Speech Union actually started doing a scoring of universities, and I think they only did it 1 year because also it was a lot of work. But I think the main problem is that you need the cooperation of universities. It helps a lot if you can have the cooperation of universities on this kind of thing. And the New Zealand Free Speech Union did a couple of surveys of academics about how free they felt to speak on certain issues. They're cited in my report. But the second time around that they did it, they had trouble getting access to kind of university emails. And they tried to send it around some email list, and there was some kind of automatic software firewall that sort of rejected their email in a lot of the cases. So they ended up with this relatively small sample. I think it was sort of 452. But also a lot of people said, oh, it's such a small sample and there's a possibility of sample bias, And that actually is sort of reasonably fair for that study. But of course, the conclusions that came out of that study are eerily similar to the ones that come out of, 4 or 5 other studies done around the same time, which have bigger sample sizes and less problems with sample bias. I mean, we did one with the Heterodox Academy, or Heterodox New Zealand, which is a chapter of Heterodox Academy. And we actually had Amazon gift cards to mitigate self-selection issues. So basically we said, we'll give you $100 on Amazon if you fill in our survey, which should mean that it's not just people who are already worried about free speech. It's not just culture warriors. It's like a broader sample. So anyway, that is kind of an onerous thing to do. And I guess I brought that up just because it shows that the Heterodox New Zealand survey was done by myself and my colleagues who were still at that point, all of us were still at New Zealand universities. And that made it a lot easier because we could not only put up posters around the place, but we could use email list that we had access to.
Yeah.
So that's why we put in the survey that it should really be done by some part of government who will be able to sort of force universities to play along. Even if, of course, I don't think you should like force people to take a survey. You can't do that. But the problem is now that I think that the universities, this is a problem in itself, especially in New Zealand, but I think everywhere. The New Zealand universities look at the free speech movement as kind of anathema and this sort of strange thing, even though, of course, they're only trying to defend the principles that are in the Education Training Act. But they're very, very loath to cooperate with any sort of civil society groups who are kind of trying to really help them out and help them improve their image.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a very practical recommendation. We used to have, I think most organizations have pulse surveys. If it can be done in a way that's simple, consistent, and easy and repeatable, they can be very, very effective. And another last thought on your report, James, of course, is one of the key people you mention is Karl Popper. And the fact there is this incredible history of free speech, where someone who escaped Vienna during the war went to New Zealand and wrote freely in a way that was unthinkable in continental Europe at that time, and indeed even further afield. New Zealand has a great history of academic freedom, and Karl Popper is the sort of most famous name, I think, in that story. And as you say in the report, there's an opportunity to rediscover that unique aspect of New Zealand academic freedom. So I don't know if you had any final thoughts on your report as we kind of wrap up.
Yeah, no, that's right. We don't want to romanticize Popper's experience in New Zealand too much because, he found the research environment not quite to his liking. He was basically told at one point, I believe, to sort of stop doing so much research and focus on his teaching, because that was kind of the world of New Zealand universities at the time. They thought he was kind of a bit too fancy pants, this European scholar who'd come in. But he did manage to produce The Open Society and Its Enemies, which is, one of the great formulations of what used to just be known as liberalism. Now they call it classical liberalism to distinguish it from progressivism, I suppose. But, he's against autocracy on the left. The second volume is all about Marx. And he's against autocracy on the right. And the first volume is all about Plato. He sees Plato as a kind of figurehead of kind of hierarchical autocracy. And, he was someone of Jewish heritage in Vienna who escaped, I think in 1937. He went to England first, and then he went across to New Zealand. And, if he hadn't left Austria, it's very clear what would have happened. I think something like 14 or 15 of his family members actually died in the Holocaust. And so New Zealand played that role at the time. He could go, as he put it, to the other side of the world. I think he said New Zealand was the next furthest place in the world apart from the moon. That's what it seemed like at the time. Still seems a bit like that, actually. But if it was, actually, it was a literal safe space. It's actually accurate use of the phrase. It was a safe space for him. The Nazis weren't there. It was a liberal democracy. And he could basically, talk about what he wanted to talk about. And that's a beautiful thing. And I think it's just very sad that this stuff is happening in societies which used to kind of lead the world. And it used to be kind of like a beacon for intellectuals in the rest of the world to come to. And I think, I don't want to exaggerate, because I think you're still probably better off than in China or in Putin's Russia, or maybe even in a place like Turkey. But on certain issues, it's very, very difficult to actually have a view without being denounced, like the listener letter authors, by, all the academic institutions, or without having your event shut down. I mean, in the case of that Chinese lecture at AUT, he actually had an event on the Tiananmen Square massacre shut down effectively by the Communist Party via their embassy, right? And the New Zealand top brass of this New Zealand university just went along with it. Mm-hmm. So, we've got to watch this and hopefully kind of reverse it because it's not good.
Thank you, James. It's been an incredible conversation, and it's a great report. I think it will be referenced a lot, and we will put a link to your report in the show notes for this episode of the podcast as well. And of course, we do have a sister organisation, the Free Speech Union, which I think you've mentioned earlier on in the conversation, in New Zealand. And I think we're probably getting to the stage where, obviously we were one of the first. We're going to learn from these sister organisations around the world. I think, what you're doing in New Zealand, or what the Free Speech Union is doing, what New Zealand Initiative is doing. We really are going to learn some best practice and share ideas. And I think that's one of the most exciting things to come out of kind of creating these networks around the world.
And hopefully there'll be some competition as well, because my great hope now is that if the Labour Party do repeal the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act in the UK, then we can maybe nab it and get a version of it in place in New Zealand, and then we can start stealing heterodox, free-thinking academics from the UK.
We'll post it to you. It will take a while.
Okay.
You'll probably have to pay a tax when you on arrival.
Not as long as in Karl Popper's day. I think it took sort of a month or something for a letter to get in those days. But yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. Really appreciate it. And Jan, you just wanted to say something about an event that's coming up, didn't you, as well? Back in the UK.
On a completely different note, away from academia, a Light Relief, which is our Free Speech Union annual comedy night, is taking place in London on the 17th of December. That's in 2 weeks' time. Tickets are selling fast, and I think we'll sell out this year. So if you're thinking of coming, get your ticket now. And we've also got an addition to the lineup. So the MC for the night is Dominic Frisby, who everybody will know. Brilliant, does a musical turn as well as MCing for the whole night. Headliner is Adam Bloom, a very long-standing comedian. I remember when he was like hot young thing. Scott Capurro, completely outrageous. Even I find him shocking, and I'm as vulgar as they come. Jonathan Cogan, Nicholas DeSanto, but also we've got Intel Lady, who some people may have spotted on Twitter and various other platforms and YouTube. She does the most fantastic impression of Angela Rayner. Angela Rayner, proud Northerner, basic instinct enthusiastic is her tagline, and she's the one who's coined this phrase, us Labours, but she's very good, and she's going to be doing a special guest appearance, so we're really glad to have secured her for the evening. So do go to our website and get your tickets now, because otherwise you may well be disappointed if you leave it too long.
It all sounds suitably outrageous, Jan. Comedy unleashed in name and comedy unleashed by nature.
In a sticky floored comedy club.
You're losing them now. It's
as it ought to be.
But thank you, James, again. Really appreciate you joining us today. And really interesting piece of research that you've done. And look forward to whatever comes out of it and whatever you do next as well. I'm sure we'll be talking again.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
No problem at all.
Thanks,